Senator Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I thank Senator McCarthy for that contribution, because as I was listening to it, I thought to myself what very, very powerful arguments they are for the government's media reform package. Because I think there's a misunderstanding, and I'll get to this in more detail as I sort of progress in the time that's available to me tonight, but I think there's a misunderstanding about how you preserve diversity in the Australian media landscape, but more particularly, I think more urgently, what is the current risk and threat that exists to diversity in the Australian landscape, media landscape. And I'll come to that in a moment, because there's some very informed views around the issue of diversity that come from media operators themselves, and as well informed as we might be in this place, no one understands the media business better than media operators themselves. And I think importantly, the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission has made some important comments in regards to media ownership and the effect on diversity in the media landscape. But let's be clear about this. What the Labor Party in the Australian Senate is doing this evening by delaying and I suspect ultimately voting down the government's media reform package is to delay the government's attempt to better protect Australian children from gambling advertising. The Australian Labor Party— It's late, and I'm sure your comments are more misinformed at this late hour, Senator Dastyari, than they are normally.
Address your remarks to
Thank you
the
very
Chair.
much, Mr Acting Deputy President. So let's also be clear that when the Labor Party talks about opposition to these media reforms, not only are they talking about delaying protecting children from gambling advertising, they're also talking about unnecessarily delaying the necessary modernisation of the Australian broadcasting sector. They're ignoring Labor's decision to delay and vote down the government's media reforms, if that's where we get to. That's because they are consciously choosing to, in addition to delaying the protection of children, delaying the modernisation of the Australian broadcasting sector, they're choosing to ignore that very, very rapid change that is happening in regards to consumer behaviour. I've often said, Senator Dastyari, that you would make a better Sam Dastyari MP than a Senator Dastyari, but don't distract me. Don't distract me.
Your remarks to the Chair,
don't distract me. And importantly, what the Labor Party seeks to do this evening, and if it's delayed until August when we come back after the recess, is to continue to shackle the free-to-air broadcasters that are operating in a very constrained financial environment, free-to-air broadcasters that would like to be unshackled to better deliver Australian drama, Australian content, Australian sport. So it's interesting that when the opposition senators and others talk about their support for reform, but really there's some elements of the reform that we don't like, so therefore we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. They're doing not just the media industry a disservice, they're doing the parents of children that might find themselves in the face of gambling advertising a disservice, and most importantly, they're doing a disservice to the free-to-air broadcasters in our country that want to be unshackled, that want to provide better services to consumers. Now, what the Labor Party says, but it's clear that they don't understand what they say, because if they understood what they say, they would be supporting media reform on the basis that the continued rapid decline in terms of the financial viability of Australian media proprietors is a real risk. It exists today. It is happening at a very, very fast rate. So any continued delay in what is a very, very sensible and well-balanced media reform package serves to undermine the interests that Labor senators come into this place this evening to say that they actually support. You are undermining your own arguments by opposing this important reform package. Now, I've been associated with the government's attempts at media reform for some time. In my role as the chairman of the government's Communications Backbench Committee, I have worked closely with Senator Fifield and other government members, National Party members and Liberal Party members, to best steer a path around media reform. And it's just worth noting how far the government has come on the important issue of media reform. Under the leadership of the former Prime Minister, media reform was, to use his words, off the table. Off the table. It was not going to happen. Then, after careful stewardship by Senator Fifield, the Coalition came to a consensus view about the suitability of preserving the 75% reach rule and came to a consensus view about the suitability of retaining the 2 out of 3 media ownership rule. And that consensus was that these two regulatory rules were no longer fit for purpose for the Australian media reform industry. And what informed those opinions significantly was not the attitude of big media proprietors, but the attitudes of media proprietors and media operators that were operating in the regional marketplace in this country. Those very people that Senator McCarthy applauded tonight because of the services and the diversity that they deliver to regional people, and in her specific case, to regional people and Indigenous people living in our remote communities. And if I might just digress for one moment, Mr Acting Deputy President, if I could just applaud the great work of Sandy Dan at the Galari radio station in the Kimberley. Senator Siewert would know Sandy Dan as well. Yep, and 99.7 FM for those people that might want to tune in. But in all seriousness, Galari is exactly one of those radio stations, delivering exactly the sorts of services that Senator McCarthy talked about, and Senator Ludlam's familiar with them as well. Exactly the sorts of services that Senator McCarthy was talking about this evening. So I argue, and I'll get to this shortly, the Senate committee report argued this, the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission argues this, that the best way to preserve diversity in the Australian media marketplace is to lift the rules, lift the regulations, not to continue to impose them. So let's just be clear. When Labor Party members of the House of Representatives yesterday voted down the government's media reform bills, they were voting down licence fee relief for commercial television and radio broadcasters. They voted down a fairer and more sensible tax arrangements for Spectrum to ensure the public receives a fair return on this public asset. They voted down media ownership changes that will support Australian companies and Australian jobs against foreign tech competitors. They voted against new local television content protections for rural and regional communities, and they voted down and they rejected anti-siphoning reform for subscription television in this country. It's easy to dismiss the tremendous amount of success that has been achieved over the last 2 years, and importantly, all too easy to dismiss that important consensus that was reached first inside the Coalition, secondly amongst media proprietors themselves, and ambitiously the government thought a consensus that might have been able to be reached first in the House of Representatives, but no, let's hope that that consensus might be able to be achieved in the Australian Senate. Now, if you could indulge me for one moment, Mr Acting Deputy President, I just want to read from an opinion piece that I wrote and I had published in the Australian Financial Review on the 4th of January 2016. 2016, because it does demonstrate how far the government has come, how far the community has come, how far media proprietors and media operators have come, but unfortunately, how little distance the Australian Labor Party has been able to travel on the important issue of media reform. In that opinion piece, and I think this is important because it reflects on the comment that I made a little while ago about just how far the hurdles that we had to overcome inside the Coalition Party room in order to get to this very, very significant achievement that we're hoping that Labor Party senators might embrace tonight. Anyway, to begin, the opinion piece starts this. In the middle of 2015, it was widely predicted by many insiders that media reform was off the table. Yet, as the new year opens, the government is entering the final phase of deliberations that may bring an end to the redundant reach rule and possibly the death of another out-of-date media ownership rule, colloquially known as 2 out of 3. With virtually all players conceding the reach rule, which restricts competition and choice in regional media markets, is past its use-by date, the debate is now focused on how best to safeguard local content. Resolution on this point is closer than many realise, with the views of the key parties broadly aligned. Importantly, when reflecting on this alignment, this includes regionally focused Liberal and National MPs who are setting their minds to a plan that will both preserve media coverage and choice in regional communities while at the same time enabling regional broadcasters to reverse their challenging financial experiences of recent years. This is a very important piece of media reform. By any measure, if successful in the Senate, this will be a significant piece of legislative reform in its own right that will stand up against other significant pieces of legislation that the government has brought in, not just since Mr Turnbull's Prime Ministership, but indeed under Mr Abbott's Prime Ministership as well. So if there is any balance, if there's any sensible view, if there's any real understanding inside the minds of Labor Party senators, they will understand that the best way to arrest the financial decline, to arrest the increasing lack of viability in the Australian media industry, it is to support these reforms. It is to support these reforms. So what I would like to do is just to give a voice to some of those media operators who know their industry the best, that know their industry much better than anyone here in this place, and encourage other senators to listen to the contributions that they have made arguing for reform of their own industry. Now, when other people argue for reform of their industry, whether it be public or private industry, we often hear Labor Party senators coming into this place and giving a voice to the virtues of those people that seek reform in other areas. But somehow, for some reason, when media operators themselves argue for reform, they're treated with suspicion. They're treated with disdain. Now, it is true that the Australian media market is tremendously competitive, and the fact that operators themselves have been able to reach an agreement suggests that the issues are not just live for them, but they're also very, very urgent and critical. So I'd just like to start, if I might, just with the two of the more publicly challenged media operators in our country. 10, and Senator Ludlam made some commentary in regards to some of the challenges that Channel 10 face, but also Fairfax Media. The 10 network, in its submission to the Senate Environment and Communications report on the media reform bills, made this comment. It said, removing these outdated media laws, and I think it's important to remember that at this point I'm focusing on the reach rule and the 2 out of 3 rule, which are at the heart, if you like, of the consensus that we thought had been reached in regards to media reform. Channel 10 said, removing these outdated media laws is an important step in dismantling a set of regulations that are making Australian media companies less competitive in a global converged media market at a time when the foreign technology companies continue to grow and dominate digital advertising revenue growth at astonishing rates. By arbitrarily restricting Australian media companies' access to scale, capital and cross-platform growth, the current rules threaten the ongoing viability of Australian diversity and a local voice. And I can't help but go back to Senator McCarthy's contribution, Senator Back. What Senator McCarthy's contribution focused on was the importance of having local voices in our media, the importance of having local voices telling local stories in their local communities, in their regional and remote local communities, and they want to stand in the way of that one thing that media operators say will give voices, improve local content for those regional and remote communities. Let me just turn briefly then to what Fairfax Media had to say, again in its contribution to the Senate Environment and Communications report, or inquiry, then report on the government's media reform bills. And this is important because I think it's fair to say that no one realises, no one has to deal on a day-to-day basis with the challenges of a changing media landscape than Fairfax Media. Mr Greg Highwood said in his submission, it was October 2016, which again demonstrates, the length of which this debate has actually been happening, but also the important progress it's made. So Mr Highwood says, one of the most persistent issues has been the pervasive and increasing influence of the giant global search engines and social media platforms on the Australian media industry. From Fairfax Media's point of view, the extent to which these organisations, based offshore and diverting advertising revenue away from and undermining Australian media companies that invest in local content and journalists and which pay taxes, is one of the prime justifications for abolishing the 2 out of 3 restriction. This artificial and outdated restriction, it's worth repeating, this artificial and outdated restriction is a disincentive to investment in the Australian media and a severe brake on our ability to compete against global competition. So let me put that a different way. The Labor Party's opposition to reform of the 2 out of 3 rule is allowing an artificial and outdated restriction to continue to exist, is allowing a disincentive to investment in Australian media to continue to exist, and they are, by their actions, continuing to put a severe brake on the media industry's ability to compete against global competition. It's ironic because the things that Labor senators think that they are protecting by opposing the 2 out of 3 rule are in actual fact driving a further deterioration of the Australian media landscape in communities that are important to Senator Mackenzie, who's in the Senate tonight, communities that have been important that Senator Back has represented this evening, and indeed communities that are important to myself. Let me just turn to the comments that Ian Audsley, Grant Blackley and Andrew Lancaster made in their contribution to the Senate Committee report. And I draw this out particularly because I'm not ashamed to say worked very, very closely behind the scenes when inside the coalition we worked assiduously to find a consensus amongst Liberal and National Party regional MPs on this important issue, and a great credit to many National Party MPs, a great credit to many Liberal MPs representing regional communities. We found that consensus. We found that consensus. And then the media industry itself finds that consensus, and then of course we come to the Australian Senate, and unfortunately Labor senators can't find it in themselves to embrace sensible reform. But let me just share with you what Mr Ian Audsley, Grant Blakely and Andrew Lancaster said. Surely the evidence is clear. Surely the case has been made. We doubt there is a politician in Canberra who wants to say they presided over an outdated regulatory regime that held back regional media. We doubt, they said, there is a politician in Canberra who wants to say that they presided over an outdated regulatory regime that held back regional media. Well, perhaps it falls on me, Senator Back. Perhaps it falls on me, Senator Mackenzie, to name those politicians in Canberra, in the Australian Senate, at 11:30 on this Thursday night, who want to preside over an outdated regulatory regime that will hold back regional media interests. Let me name them. Senator Dastyari, Senator Pratt, Senator Billick, Senator Farrell. I think I've made the point. But in all seriousness, and I haven't reflected on Senator Ludlam's contribution, because if there is one person in this place who perhaps does know a lot about the Australian media industry and the changing nature of the media industry after Senator Fifield, it probably is Senator Ludlam. But this is a significant piece of reform. It deserves to be looked at dispassionately. People should put their historical and partisan prejudices behind them, because this is a historic media reform landscape package that will change the landscape, that will liberate local content in our country, and that will well serve media operators as well as consumers. And it deserves your support, Senator Dastyari.
Thank you, very much, Senator